Hey everyone! Today I will be painting a mixed media portrait using acrylic and colored pencil on wood. This was actually a request from a family member who was getting a gift for a friend whose puppy had passed away. I do want to convey that this is a commission and that I do not work for free, so if you do have a pet portrait that you would like to have done, feel free to contact me, but remember it is actually going to cost money. I sketched the image and then I transferred that sketch over to the wood block so that it would be easier for me to paint and get nice clean lines. I used colored pencil to make the sketch, and that gives it a little more of a waxy finish, which isn't going to be as susceptible to melting as graphite might be. I was given free rein to kind of do whatever I wanted, and all my family member did was tell me what size they wanted the piece to be, and I just went from there. I start by letting the wood soak up some of the acrylic that's watered down. This helps to make a base of color. We're still going to get the wood grain through there, which is something that I like about this technique, but it's going to slowly build layers of color. The more water that I add to the acrylic and the more watered down it becomes, the more translucent it becomes. The less water I add and the drier the paint, the more it's going to be opaque and stand out. One of the slightly difficult things about this particular technique is you get a little bit of a deceptive color when you have the wood panel a little wet, because it'll make the panel look darker than it is, and so it's a little bit of an illusion how much contrast I have between the acrylic and the panel. But acrylic is pretty merciful. You can do a lot with it and not really worry too much. For the most part, I use round brushes for this. I use whatever feels right. I do have a lot of round brushes and I do use some square brushes, though I'm not sure that they're really my preference unless I'm going for a specific look, and usually that's on a bigger panel than this one. I don't like to sketch the entire painting out when I'm working, so this one has a looser background to it. This is a piece that I completed in about 4 hours, and a piece that I really like for the combination of the tighter colored pencil and the looser acrylics on top. But I didn't want to sketch out all the stones behind the dog. In the photo that I got as a reference, he's sitting in front of a stone wall. And there's all these greens and tans and beiges and ochres behind him, and I didn't really think that it initially needed that much of a line to define it. As I continue to add layers to this piece, I will add more definition to each one of these stones. I'm going to work with more opacity now. It's very hard for me not to just take a big glob of white and really carve out shapes, which is something I could have done, but then I would have lost the wood grain, and I like that a lot. Another thing about working on wood panel is that when it's wet, your paint will spread a little bit more, so you get a much softer appearance to it than when you use a drier paint on a drier panel. I think throughout this video my hands just continue to get covered in more paint. At this point I'm still building out that stone wall behind him, and every once in a while I'm flicking paint onto the sidewalk that he's sitting on. I was a little stuck on how to do the sidewalk texture. I did flick some paint onto it, and I think I'm going to go back in with colored pencil and draw that out. I also didn't want to make this too monochrome either. Yep, there we go. I'm actually using a toothbrush. This is a good way to get some texture on here. It flicks paint on in a very pleasing, random manner. I'm not someone who wants to go in and draw and shade every pebble and every texture, and this is a way to really add noise and texture to the painting. There's my handy dandy little hairdryer. I never feel like waiting long enough for something to dry by itself, so I always have that hairdryer by my side, ready to go. Ooh, and here's one of the more fun parts. I love refining things with colored pencil. I'm not one for doing full colored pencil drawings anymore. I used to. They're extremely time consuming, but the feeling of colored pencil, and these are Prismacolors by the way, on a wood panel is just fun. They've got this really nice waxy texture to them, and that's very pleasant when you are drawing on a hard surface like this. When you draw on paper, there's a little bit of give to it. When you're working with wood, it's an unyielding surface, so unless you really press down, and I don't even know if you could with a colored pencil, you're not going to dent it unless it's a very soft wood. So at this point I started working with negative space because I wanted there to be a little more contrast in this piece. Right now it's all light and mid tones, and I wanted to have some darker tones in the piece to balance it out. The photo has these beautiful yellow flowers that are spilling over this wall, and the only way that I'm really going to be able to make them pop is if I do a darker background behind them. Otherwise, they're just going to blend in with the beige of the wood, and it's just not going to stand out as much. Ah yes, adding water can make for some interesting effects. It's not going to be the same as on paper when you do it on wood. You can see that it dries when I blow dry it a little bit and you get some of that stain on the wood, but it's not quite the same as on paper where you'll get a lot more definition. I didn't want the stones to just be gray. I wanted them to have a little more color. The dog himself is this warm tan, and using blue will make him stand out all the more, and any yellows or golds or greens will contrast with the blue. This is kind of a limited color palette for me. I ended up doing analogous colors, which are colors that are right next to one another on the color wheel, so we go from blue to green to gold. I don't know if this was intentional or if it just happened, but let's pretend that it was intentional. I'm mixing white with just a little bit of my blue here so that I can make the rock look like it has more dimension, it's not so flat. Now I have to go back in and do all these stones that I didn't do earlier. I'm not the kind of person who will do one layer at a time. Other people might have a different approach where they would go in and do a flat of everything and then build up from there. I kind of just work wherever I feel like, and by the time I'm done going around to all the different sections of the painting, it's finished. I'm defining the outline of the dog now by adding some more opaque paint around his ears. Anything that wasn't very well defined with the colored pencil, when I paint around it, I can make a sharper edge. I don't want this to be a totally opaque painting. Like I said, I really do love transparency when it comes to painting on wood because you still see some of that wood grain. You can paint over it entirely, and unless you do a super thick layer, you'll still get some of the texture from the wood, but I like to see it. And because I didn't do a super heavy layer on the dog himself or on the sidewalk, there's still going to be visible wood grain through all the media that I put on top of it. Okay, this is another one of my favorite things. Once you have a darker layer, and again, because this is a wood panel, you could just go for it. Using a lighter colored pencil that has a very high opacity is just an absolute delight. It's almost like, do you remember gel pens and how great those were? It's a very similar feeling. You can bring up your tones and get a lot of highlights in there and really make something look like it has extra dimension and that it's not just all melting together into one blah mid-tone. It's enough colored pencil for now. I'm using white mixed with a little bit of beige and kind of a cream acrylic to go in and add more to the dog. He has these ochre almost socks on his legs, so I painted those in. Look at his cute little paws. I really wanted to emphasize those little puppy toes. One of my favorite things to draw are paws. Okay, I needed to go back in and add a little bit more to the concrete and to the wall behind. Again, I don't do anything in any particular order. Whenever I see an area that needs to be worked on, I just sort of dive right in. I also have an obsession with teeny tiny little brushes, and I try not to get into them right away, because otherwise it's like trying to fill in a piece of paper with a ballpoint pen. You can do it, and it'll look really cool, but don't you have other things to paint? I know I do. I also never go for photorealism because I'm terrible at it. I like when my work looks like a painting. If I did photorealism, A, it would look wonky because I'm bad at it, and B, it would be a completely different approach. I probably wouldn't use such a loose sketch. I would be graphing the piece over instead. Now we're getting to all that lovely definition, really getting that fur in there, outlining the eyes and the ears. We've got our midtones and we've got our highlights, and so when I need to go in now and do some more darks to really make him pop. And he also has a little bit of like salt and pepper in it in areas, so I'm trying to convey that with the colored pencil and paint. He also has such a cute little beard and mustache. We have to emphasize that, and his cute little nose. His adorable bandana and collar. What can I say? I love dogs. They are my favorite subject to paint, and if someday I am lucky, I will be able to make a living doing nothing but painting dogs. That being said, in the painting, I am using my teeny tiny brushes again and bringing in more fur texture. Oh, nope, a little bit too wet. But you know, not everything has to be perfect and tight. Now that the wood has dried a little bit, I can see where I need to add more contrast, and that's why I'm going back in with these different colors of paint, making more shadows and highlights on the stone under the dog and behind him. Let's do those little flowers I talked about earlier. I needed to go over these a couple of times. The yellow that I have wasn't super opaque, and that's alright because I want to have a little bit of dimension, but I also don't want them to sink back into the sidewalk, which is pretty mid-tony. They definitely pop a lot more on the areas that I made a much darker green. And here we are. I lost a little bit of footage, I'm sorry, but look at how cute he is. He's so fluffy, sitting there being such a good pup in his pretty little field of flowers behind that wall. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for hanging out with me while I did this piece. Anyway, if you want to follow me, my website is meganmerz.com. I can be reached at hello@meganmerz.com via email if you have any questions about commissioning a piece of your own, or I have an Instagram at megan.merz. Thank you. Bye.